Three men, one night, one woman who said yes to all of them. The date is 1695. Dueling is illegal in France. The penalty is death. And Julie d'Aubigny doesn't care. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the city. Paris, in the late 1600s, was a place of extraordinary contradictions. It was the cultural capital of the Western world, the most sophisticated city in Europe, a place of gilded halls and towering cathedrals, of poetry and philosophy and music that made grown men weep. And underneath all of that, it was brutal. Reputation was everything. A man's honor was not an abstract concept. It was his currency, his standing, his life. To be publicly humiliated in Paris was to cease to exist in any meaningful way. And so men defended their honor, the way men in that world always had, with swords. The Palais Royal masked balls were where all of this came to a head. These were not intimate gatherings. They were enormous, chaotic, electric events. Hundreds of Paris's most powerful people crammed into one blazing room, dressed in masks and costumes, and given, for one night, the gift of anonymity. The masks changed the rules. You could speak to someone above your station. You could flirt across class lines. You could be someone you weren't supposed to be. It was the one place in Paris where the rigid social architecture shifted just enough to let the city breathe. Most people used that freedom cautiously. They pushed boundaries carefully. They tested limits quietly. Julie d'Aubigny arrived at the ball that night, dressed as a man, and immediately threw all of that out the window. By 1695, Julie was not an unknown. Far from it. She was a principal performer at the Paris Opera, one of the most celebrated voices in the city. Audiences who came to see her described the experience in terms that didn't sound like they were talking about a concert. They sounded like they were talking about something closer to a religious experience. Critics exhausted their vocabulary trying to describe what she did on stage. Her voice was something France had never quite heard before. But off stage, Julie d'Aubigny was a completely different kind of spectacle. She had already dueled, already fled the law, already burned a convent to the ground and walked away from the wreckage, carrying the woman she loved. She was somewhere around 25 years old. She had already lived more lives than most people manage in a full century. And she had developed, over those 25 years, a particular relationship with consequences. Specifically, she didn't seem to have much fear of them. She arrived at the ball dressed as a man, which, for Julie d'Aubigny, was not unusual. She had been doing it since she was a teenager, moving through the world in men's clothing, carrying a sword she knew exactly how to use, passing in ways that confused and unsettled people, and clearly enjoying every second of their confusion. At some point during the evening, she met a young woman. We don't know her name. History, as it so often does with the women who cross paths with legends, didn't think to write it down. What we know is that they danced, they talked, and then, in the middle of the ballroom, in front of everyone, Julie kissed her. Now, let's sit with that for a moment. Because this was not a small thing. A masked ball gave you cover, but it didn't give you that much cover. There were limits, understood limits, unspoken rules that everyone in that room knew, even if no one had written them down. And what Julie did, broke them, loudly, publicly, without the slightest apparent concern for what came next. 3 noblemen in the room took notice. We don't know exactly who they were. History gave us the story, but not always the names. What we know is that they were men of standing, men who had grown up in a world that told them that certain things required a response, required correction. Maybe they knew who Julie was. Maybe they didn't. It's possible they genuinely had no idea that the person they were about to challenge had already killed men, had already faced a death sentence, had already proven, repeatedly, that she was not someone you wanted to meet at the end of a blade in the dark. If they didn't know, they were about to find out. They challenged her, all three of them, that night, outside. A smart person would have apologized. A careful person would have disappeared into the crowd. A person with any instinct for self-preservation would have found a way out of the room. Julie d'Aubigny accepted all three challenges, separately, in sequence, and then she walked outside, and she fought them. Before we get to what happened, let's talk about what dueling actually meant in France in 1695, because this is where most tellings of this story gloss over something important. Dueling had been illegal in France since 1626. King Louis XIII banned it by royal edict, after the practice had become, in his view, a national catastrophe. In the early decades of the 1600s, France was losing thousands of men per year, not to war, not to plague, to private duels, noblemen settling personal grievances with blades rather than courts, sons of noble families cutting each other down over perceived insults, over a look across a room, over a card game, over a woman. The crown looked at the death toll and decided it had seen enough. Louis XIII made the penalty for dueling severe, not a fine, not exile, death. Louis XIV, who came after him, reinforced that edict multiple times. Men had been executed under it. Not just common men, noblemen, men with titles and family connections, and every reason to believe the law might look the other way. Some of them were wrong. And yet, the dueling continued. Because here is the thing about honor culture, that no law has ever quite managed to extinguish. The fear of being seen as a coward was, for men in that world, worse than the fear of death. To refuse a challenge was to be finished socially, to be whispered about, to be a man who had been challenged and backed down. That was a stain that didn't wash out. So men kept dueling, and the law kept threatening to execute them for it. And most of the time, for men of noble birth, the law found ways to be flexible. A pardon here, a charge quietly dropped there, the right family connections, the right word in the right ear, and the death sentence became something more manageable. Julie d'Aubigny did not have those options. She was not a noblewoman. She didn't have a title to trade on. She didn't have a family with connections to the court. She was a performer, a woman, an outsider who had already been condemned to death once, and survived it through a combination of luck, talent, and the fact that powerful men found her too interesting to let die. She could not count on that happening again. She knew all of this. She had grown up around men who understood the law and the sword better than almost anyone in France. She understood exactly what she was risking. She went outside anyway. The details of what happened in the street that night are not recorded with precision. This was an illegal activity. Nobody was keeping official notes. What we have are accounts, passed down through the kind of breathless Parisian retelling that turns real events into mythology before the ink is dry. But the outcome is not disputed. She fought the first man. She won. She fought the second man. She won. She fought the third man. She won. 3 duels. 1 night. 0 losses. She went back inside the ball. Let that land for a moment. She went back inside the ball, not away into the night, not running for the city gates. Back inside, back to the music and the candlelight and the masked faces of Paris, as though she had just stepped out for some air. The story spread the way stories in Paris always spread. Fast, and with embellishments. By morning, everyone in the city who mattered knew what had happened. By the end of the week, it had passed from gossip into legend. Here is where it gets complicated. Because winning was not actually the good outcome. Winning meant she had fought. Winning meant she had drawn blood, possibly shed it, against men of standing. Winning meant the law now had 3 very specific, very documented reasons to come for her. A warrant was issued. Julie d'Aubigny was formally charged. The sentence, if carried out, was death. She fled Paris. This was not the first time she had run. It would not be the last. But here is the thing about Julie d'Aubigny that the law kept failing to account for. She was extraordinary. Not just as a fighter, not just as a survivor, as a performer, as a presence, as a person who walked into rooms and changed the air in them. And extraordinary people are useful to powerful men. The question of who intervened, of who looked at the warrant with her name on it, and decided that executing Julie d'Aubigny would be a waste of something France couldn't afford to lose. That is a story for the next episode. What I keep coming back to, when I think about that night at the Palais Royal, is not the duels. The duels are extraordinary. 3 men, 1 night, no losses. That part of the story writes itself. What I keep coming back to is the moment before the duels, the kiss. 3 men in that ballroom decided that what Julie did required a response, required correction, required her to be reminded of the shape of the world and her place in it. And Julie's answer was to follow them outside, one at a time, and remind them of something else entirely. France would spend the next 300 years trying to fit Julie d'Aubigny into a category it understood. Most of them missed the point. She wasn't asking to be understood. She was asking for nothing at all. She was simply living, loudly, on her own terms. And for one night in Paris in 1695, with 3 men behind her and the whole city watching, she made that look like the most natural thing in the world. But before the warrant, before the exile, before any of that, there was a younger Julie, a Julie who hadn't yet set foot in the Paris Opera, who hadn't yet kissed anyone at a royal ball, who was traveling the roads of France with a fencing master and a hat pulled low, fighting strangers for money, and winning. Next time on, they became legends, the mysterious swordsman. The crowds couldn't stop watching.